Hey there, sleepy wasteland wanderers. Tonight, we're diving into the haunting beauty of the Fallout universe, where broken cities whisper forgotten stories, and every shadow hides a tale of survival. Cryptids, the most mysterious creatures in Fallout. Welcome, fellow wanderer of the wasteland, to a journey through the darkest corners of the irradiated wilderness, where the firelight ends and something older than nuclear fire begins. Tonight we explore every cryptid that the wasteland has produced and preserved and refuse to explain the creatures that move at the edge of what the survivors know, that leave footprints in the ash no field guide can identify, that have been seen by people who could not forget what they saw and could not convince anyone else to believe them. So settle in, make yourself comfortable, and let the darkness carry you gently into sleep. The creatures are out there, they always have been. There is a particular kind of darkness that belongs to the wilderness rather than to the city, a darkness that the campfire has always represented the human refusal to simply accept. Before the bombs fell, before the resource wars reduced the question of civilization to a practical rather than a philosophical problem, before the Great War ended the argument about what humanity was capable of by demonstrating the full extent of the answer, people had always built fires in the dark and gathered close to them and told each other stories about what lived beyond the light. These stories were not simply entertainment, though they functioned as that too. They were a form of cartography, an attempt to map the boundaries of the known world by populating the unknown one with specific and nameable things, because a darkness that contains something you can describe is less threatening than a darkness that contains nothing you can reach with language. America had its own tradition of this cartography, a regional mythology so dense and so varied and so thoroughly embedded in the specific geographies that produced it, that it constituted a form of folk science, an attempt by communities without formal scientific institutions to document and categorize the genuinely strange things that their environments periodically produced. The Mothman of Point Pleasant, the Flatwoods Monster of Braxton County, the Snallygaster of the Maryland Valley Country, the Sheepsquatch of the Appalachian High Country, the Wendigo of the Northern Forests. These were not simply stories that ignorant people told because they did not understand the world around them. They were observations, imprecisely recorded by observers, without the vocabulary or the institutional support to do better, of things that the communities encountering them recognized as genuinely outside the normal parameters of their experience. The Great War did not eliminate this tradition. It amplified it beyond any forecast that the most optimistic cryptid enthusiast of the pre-war period could have produced, and it did so through the specific mechanism of making the environment that had always generated anomalous biological phenomena into something so thoroughly saturated with the forces that produce anomalous biological phenomena that the pre-war rate of cryptid production seems, in retrospect, almost restrained. Radiation and the forced evolutionary virus and the specific combination of catastrophic environmental disruption that the bombs produced in the years following October 23, 2077, did to the biological diversity of the wasteland what 2 centuries of industrial development had been attempting to undo. They created, in the ruins and the irradiated forests and the contaminated waterways and the geological formations that the bomb's shockwaves had altered in ways that still had not been fully mapped, a biological laboratory operating without any of the constraints that laboratory science had always required. The distinction between a mutant and a cryptid is one that the wasteland survivors have arrived at through practical necessity rather than formal taxonomy, and it is worth examining carefully because it is the distinction that organizes this entire account. Giant radroaches are mutants. Deathclaws are mutants. Even the super mutants, for all the horror they represent, are comprehensible within a framework that begins with recognizable biology and traces a path, however extreme, from there to what they have become. The wasteland's cryptids are something different, and the difference is not primarily a matter of scale or danger, though the cryptids are often dangerous and sometimes enormous. The difference is epistemological. The mutants of the wasteland can be understood with sufficient observation and sufficient scientific framework as the products of processes that the pre-war world had already identified, even if it had not yet fully controlled. The cryptids cannot. They exceed the available explanatory frameworks, not simply because the frameworks are incomplete, though they are, but because the nature of what they are does not yield to the kind of systematic examination that produces frameworks in the first place. A creature that appears before disasters and vanishes afterward is not simply a mutant that happens to occupy the same geography as disasters. A creature that seems to observe rather than simply inhabit, that moves through a landscape with the specific quality of something that is present without being native to it, is not accounted for by the processes of radiation-induced mutation that explain the death claw. A creature whose origin lies in a human being making a specific choice under specific conditions of desperation, and whose transformation encodes that choice in its biology in ways that no pre-war understanding of physiology can explain, represents something the mutant taxonomy was not built to contain. The cryptids of the wasteland are the things that fall outside the categories, and the categories that have fallen outside do not stop being real simply because nothing in the available science is equipped to process them. The geography of Appalachia is essential to understanding why the wasteland's cryptid population is concentrated there in ways that no other region of post-nuclear America matches. West Virginia had always been, even before the bombs, the most concentrated zone of regional monster mythology in the country, and this was not coincidental. The specific combination of dense forest, complex river systems, isolated mountain communities, industrial development operating in close proximity to relatively undisturbed natural environments, and a cultural tradition that took its local folklore seriously enough to preserve and transmit it through generations that might otherwise have let it fade. All of these factors had made West Virginia the place where America's cryptid tradition was most alive and most specific before the war ended everything else. After the war, these pre-existing conditions interacted with the catastrophic changes that the nuclear exchange and its aftermath had produced in ways that neither the cryptid enthusiasts of the pre-war period nor the survivors of the immediate post-war chaos could have anticipated with any precision. The forests that had always concealed the sheepsquatch were now forests where the undergrowth had been reshaped by 2 centuries of radiation into configurations that bore only partial resemblance to what the pre-war ecologist would have recognized. The rivers where the Ogwa had been sighted were now rivers carrying contamination loads that would have been unthinkable as a research scenario before the war. Supporting biological communities that evolved under pressures the field of aquatic ecology had never been asked to address. The geological features of the region, already among the most complex in the eastern United States, had been further altered by the physical effects of nearby detonations and the subsequent decades of environmental transformation. The Appalachian cryptid had always been a product of a specific and unusual environment. After the war, that environment became something so far outside normal parameters that the products it generated were correspondingly extraordinary. The cults and communities that developed around specific cryptids in post-war Appalachia represent a form of cultural adaptation to genuinely anomalous experience that the pre-war world had expressed primarily through the Mothman Festival of Point Pleasant and the various tourism industries that had grown up around the region's monster mythology. These institutions were, in their pre-war form, partly sincere and partly commercial, serving both the genuine believers who organized their understanding of the regional landscape around the cryptids they documented, and the tourists and curious observers who came from outside the region to engage with the mythology from a comfortable distance. After the war, the comfortable distance disappeared. The people of Appalachia were no longer visitors to a monster landscape, but inhabitants of one, and the response to this reality, the formation of the children of the Mothman, the emergence of cryptid hunting as a serious post-war vocation, the integration of specific cryptid encounters into the survival knowledge that communities transmitted to their members reflected the genuine seriousness of what they were encountering. The epistemological challenge that the wastelands cryptids present is inseparable from the broader epistemological challenge that the wasteland presents to its survivors in every domain of knowledge. When the pre-war world ended, it took with it not just the institutions that had maintained scientific knowledge, but also the context within which scientific knowledge had meaning, the stable reference points, the predictable physical environment, the baseline against which anomalies could be identified as anomalies, rather than simply as more features of an already profoundly strange landscape. In the wasteland, the threshold for what qualifies as unbelievably strange has shifted so dramatically from its pre-war position that the specific strangeness of the cryptids is genuinely difficult to isolate. A world that contains ghouls and super-mutants and sentient artificial intelligences and the surviving remnants of a pre-war government conducting biological experiments from a fortified bunker in the ruins of a luxury resort. This is a world in which a vast, winged creature with luminescent red eyes appearing before catastrophic events and then disappearing is strange, but strange in a way that has to compete with an enormous amount of other strangeness for the attention and concern of the people who encounter it. And yet the cryptids retain their quality of exceeding the available frameworks, even in a world where those frameworks have been dramatically revised. This is the detail that marks them as genuinely distinct from the wasteland's other anomalies. The ghouls and the supermutants and the various other products of FEV and radiation exposure can all be placed, however uncomfortably, within a framework that begins with pre-war biology and traces the paths of specific types of disruption from there to what the wasteland has produced. The cryptids resist this placement. They appear and vanish. They behave in ways that suggest awareness of a kind that mutation alone does not produce. They carry in their specific characteristics the specific details of legends that preceded the bombs by decades and sometimes by centuries, as if the wasteland had decided that the old stories deserved to be made real rather than simply updated. What follows is an attempt to understand each of the wasteland's most significant cryptids, not as items in a catalogue of dangers, but as the specific and irreplaceable phenomena. They are each one a question that the wasteland has posed, and that the survivors who have encountered it have answered in whatever terms their available vocabulary and their specific circumstances allowed. Some of those answers have been scientific. Some have been spiritual. Some have been the practical answer of people who understood that whether they could explain a thing mattered considerably less than whether they could survive encountering it. None of them have been complete. The cryptids of the wasteland have not been designed to yield complete answers. And this is perhaps the most important thing about them. They are the wasteland's reminder that the universe contains more than the bombs destroyed, more than the survivors have mapped, more than the available science has been asked to address. The fire is burning low. The darkness beyond it is very old. Let us go and see what it contains. There are legends that begin as warnings and end as religions, that start in the specific terror of an individual encounter and accumulate, through repetition and transmission, and the particular alchemy of stories told in the dark by people who genuinely needed to believe them, into something that organizes entire communities around its central image. The Mothman is this kind of legend, and it was this kind of legend before the bombs fell, and the wasteland's extraordinary biological creativity gave it flesh and wings, and the specific luminescent red that has become the detail. No survivor who has seen it can omit when they describe what they saw. The image of those eyes in the darkness precedes every other detail of every Mothman account recorded in the ruins of Appalachia, arriving in the telling before the wings and the height, and the unsettling human-adjacent body plan, because the eyes are the thing that the mind fixes on when everything else about an encounter exceeds its capacity for orderly processing. You do not think, when the Mothman is before you, about its wingspan or its biological category. You think about the eyes, because the eyes are looking back, and what the eyes communicate in that moment of mutual regard is the thing that no account of the creature has yet been able to fully put into language. The legend that the wasteland inherited was already old. Point Pleasant, West Virginia, had been living with the Mothman for over a century before the Great War made the question of what the region's most famous cryptid actually was into something considerably more urgent than a topic for annual festivals and regional tourism. The sightings of 1966 and 67 that anchored the Mothman in American regional mythology were genuine events in the sense that the people who reported them were not lying, not confused in the ordinary way of people who mistake known phenomena for unknown ones, and not speaking from a tradition of prior belief that shaped their perception toward a predetermined conclusion. They were people who saw something in the hills and fields and bridge approaches of Mason County, West Virginia, that they had no prior category for, and who described what they saw with the specific consistency that characterizes genuine novel experience, rather than the generative inconsistency that characterizes folk embellishment. The details that recurred across independent accounts were not the details that a storytelling tradition would have settled on as most dramatically effective. They were stranger and more specific and harder to explain away than a manufactured legend would have needed to be. The association between the Mothman sightings and the Silver Bridge collapse of December 15th, 1967, the bridge failure that killed 46 people in Point Pleasant, and that has since become inseparable from the Mothman mythology, regardless of whether the connection is causal or simply temporal, established the interpretive framework that the children of the Mothman would later inherit and systematize. The creature had appeared in the area for over a year before the bridge fell. It had been seen near the bridge approach on multiple occasions. Whether it had appeared on the bridge itself on the night of the collapse was a question that the chaos of the disaster made impossible to resolve with certainty, and this irresolvability was central to what the legend became, because it left permanently open the question of whether the Mothman had been present at the disaster because it caused it, because it knew it was coming, because it was drawn by the proximity of mass death, or because the people who needed the disaster to have a supernatural dimension imposed that dimension on a creature that simply happened to inhabit the same geography. The wasteland made this question considerably more complicated by providing the creature itself as an ongoing presence rather than a historical enigma. In post-war Appalachia, you did not need to debate the Mothman's existence. It was there, in the irradiated forests and the ruins of the river communities and the high approaches of the mountains, that had always provided it with the territory that the legend described. The question the wasteland posed was not whether it existed, but what, exactly, it was, and this question proved no easier to answer with the creature physically present than it had been during the century when it existed only in accounts. The physical description of the fallout Mothman is both consistent with its folkloric predecessor and extended beyond it in ways that the game's designers clearly chose carefully. The wingspan is enormous, sufficient to carry a body that is broadly humanoid in its proportions, while being in every specific detail not human in the way that the term normally implies. The body stands upright, moves with the specific quality of something that occupies the upright position as a natural stance rather than an achieved one, but the proportions are wrong in ways that the eye registers before the conscious mind has time to catalogue the specific deviations. The face, or what the face region presents, is organized around the eyes in a way that makes the eyes not simply a feature of the face, but the face's entire communicative apparatus. Everything else is secondary to the specific intensity of the gaze, to the luminescent red that is the detail that every account preserves with the fidelity of something burned rather than simply observed. The variance that the wasteland's particular biology has produced from this baseline represent the most interesting evidence available for whatever processes are operating in the Mothman's biology. The standard variant is dangerous and territorial in the way of a large apex predator, but the dangerousness and territoriality are legible within the conventional framework of threat assessment that the wasteland's survivors have developed for dealing with large, mutated fauna. The glowing Mothman exceeds this framework immediately and completely, because a creature that produces its own bioluminescence at the intensity that the glowing Mothman achieves has crossed a biological threshold that even the wasteland's most extreme examples of radiation-induced mutation rarely reach. The glow is not incidental, not a simple metabolic byproduct of radiation absorption, but a phenomenon of sufficient intensity to transform the creature from a biological entity into something that approaches the description of a natural phenomenon, a thing encountered in the dark that appears to produce its own light from some internal source whose mechanism has not been identified by any survivor who has survived long enough to attempt an identification. The wise Mothman is the variant that most thoroughly defeats the framework of conventional mutant taxonomy, and it does so not through any dramatic display of capability, but through the specific quality of its behavior in the presence of human beings. The creatures of the wasteland are, with certain notable exceptions, comprehensible as either threats or non-threats, as predators or as fauna that can be navigated around through sufficient knowledge of their behavioral patterns. The wise Mothman is neither, or is both simultaneously, in a way that the binary does not accommodate. It watches. It does not attack unless the encounter develops in specific ways that suggest it has criteria for deciding when attack is appropriate. It does not flee, which would be the behavior of prey, but it also does not engage, which would be the behavior of a territorial predator. It is present in the specific way of something that has chosen to be present, that is there because it has decided that the location and the moment have something to offer, and its departure when it departs carries the same quality of decision rather than flight or aggression. The children of the Mothman developed in the specific environment of post-war Appalachia as the most complete attempt to build a theological framework around an encounter with something genuinely inexplicable. Their central interpretive moved the decision to understand the Mothman not as a predator or a mutant or a threat, but as a messenger whose medium was disaster, whose appearances were communications rather than behaviors, was not simply the superstitious response of a pre-scientific community to a phenomenon it lacked the tools to explain. It was, within its own logic, a sophisticated response to the available evidence. If the Mothman does appear before disasters, and the cult's documented record of appearances and subsequent events presents a correlation that is difficult to dismiss entirely as confirmation bias, then the question of what to do with this information is a genuinely practical one. A messenger whose messages are encoded in appearances rather than language requires a different kind of literacy than the one that conventional communication demands, and the children of the Mothman had dedicated generations of careful observation to developing exactly this literacy. The theology that organized around this interpretive framework was, by the standards of religious systems, developed under conditions of extreme adversity, remarkably coherent. The Mothman was understood not as a god, but as an intermediary, a creature of sufficient awareness and capability to perceive the approach of catastrophic events, and of sufficient relationship to humanity to make its perceptions available, however indirectly and however difficult to decode, through the specific act of appearing in the locations where those catastrophic events would occur. The cult's practice of documenting sightings and correlating them with subsequent events was not mysticism but a form of record-keeping that any epidemiologist would recognize as the appropriate methodology for establishing the relationship between a proposed cause and a proposed effect, conducted without the statistical tools that professional epidemiology would require, and with the interpretive enthusiasm that statistical tools are designed to correct for, but genuine in its attempt to understand the creature through its patterns rather than simply through its presence. The question of whether the Mothman actually predicts disasters, or whether the children of the Mothman have simply found in the creature a focus for the heightened pattern recognition that the wasteland's constant low-level danger produces in everyone who survives long enough to develop. It is one that the available evidence does not resolve. The cult's records document cases where Mothman appearances preceded significant events with a specificity that seems difficult to account for through chance alone. They also, inevitably, document cases where no significant event followed a sighting, and cases where significant events occurred without a prior sighting being reported. And the theological framework that the cult has developed is sufficiently flexible to accommodate these discordant data points, without abandoning the central proposition that the correlation is real and meaningful. This flexibility is either the mark of a belief system capable of withstanding disconfirmation, which is a theological virtue, or the mark of a hypothesis that has been protected from falsification through post hoc adjustment of the criteria by which it is evaluated, which is a scientific failure. The wasteland does not, in general, provide the conditions that allow this distinction to be made with confidence. What the wasteland does provide, through the encounters that its survivors have documented and the accounts that have accumulated in the terminals and holotapes that serve as its most durable archive, is a portrait of a creature whose behavior consistently exceeds what the available biological frameworks predict, and whose relationship to human beings is considerably more complex than the predator-prey or territorial intruder, dynamics that account for most interactions between the wasteland's fauna and its survivors. The Mothman has been seen to approach human settlements without attacking them. It has been seen to observe individual survivors with a sustained attention that suggests the observation is meaningful to it in some way that goes beyond the assessment of a predator evaluating potential prey. It has been seen, in the most frequently cited accounts, at locations and in advance of events that were subsequently disastrous in ways that the creature could not have known about through any sensory mechanism that conventional biology provides. The red eyes, in the darkness, looking back, this is the Mothman's essential communication, whatever it means. It is aware of you in the specific way that very few things in the wasteland are aware of you, not as prey, not as a territorial challenge, not as an obstacle or an irrelevance, as something it has chosen to regard, for reasons that the available evidence does not make clear, and that the tradition of encounter with it has accumulated but not resolved. The children of the Mothman call this regard a blessing, the attention of a divine messenger whose interest in a human being presages something significant about that human being's relationship to the events that are approaching. The cryptid hunters who have documented the creature from a more secular perspective note simply that being regarded by the Mothman without being attacked is an experience that the people who undergo it consistently describe as the most unsettling encounter of their wasteland lives, more unsettling in retrospect than encounters that were physically dangerous, because physical danger is at least a framework that the mind knows how to process. The Mothman persists in the irradiated forests of Appalachia as the wasteland's most discussed, most documented, most theologically significant, and most fundamentally unresolved cryptid. 2 centuries of encounters have not produced a consensus about what it is, what its appearances mean, whether the pattern that the children of the Mothman have spent their institutional existence documenting represents genuine predictive behavior, or the most elaborate example of confirmation bias in the wasteland's considerable inventory of such things. The red eyes continue to appear in the dark above the river communities and the mountain settlements and the ruins of the towns that the bombs spared enough of to leave standing. The accounts continue to accumulate. The question that the first sighters of 1966 were asking in the fields and bridge approaches of Mason County is the same question that the wasteland survivors are asking in the irradiated forests of post-war West Virginia, and it remains, as it has always remained, the question that the creature itself seems most perfectly designed to leave permanently open. The Flatwoods monster arrived differently from the other cryptids of Appalachia, and the nature of its arrival is the most important thing about it. Most of the wasteland's unexplained creatures can be understood, however imperfectly, as having emerged from the landscape as things that the specific combination of radiation and biological disruption and environmental catastrophe produced from materials that were already present in the region before the bombs fell. Their strangeness is the strangeness of transformation, of the familiar rendered unrecognizable through forces whose effects exceeded any pre-war prediction. The Flatwoods monster does not have this quality. It does not feel transformed. It feels arrived, present in the Appalachian landscape in the specific way of something that came from somewhere else and has not entirely committed to being here rather than there. The historical event that grounded the Flatwoods monster in American regional mythology was precise and specific, in a way that the more diffuse origins of other cryptid legends were not. On September 12, 1952, in the small community of Flatwoods in Braxton County, West Virginia, 6 local boys and a woman named Kathleen May encountered something in a field following the passage of what they and others had observed as a bright, moving light in the sky. The accounts that the witnesses provided in the immediate aftermath, before the story had been processed through the interpretive frameworks that subsequent retelling would impose on it, described a figure approximately 10 feet tall, wearing what appeared to be a dark hood or cowl of a spade-like shape, emitting a mist that caused irritation and nausea in those who approached it, and departing in a manner that the witnesses found impossible to account for within the parameters of ordinary movement. The encounter lasted only a few minutes, but produced symptoms in the witnesses: respiratory irritation, nausea, repeated vomiting that persisted for days afterward, and that were treated by local physicians who could not identify their cause within the available diagnostic framework of 1952 medicine. What distinguished the Flatwoods sighting from other mid-century cryptid encounters was the specificity of the physical symptoms it produced in its witnesses. Most cryptid encounters left behind only memory, however vivid and however persistent. The Flatwoods encounter left behind measurable physiological effects that required medical attention and that connected the experience to a material reality that the witness's testimony alone could not have established with the same force. The mist that the creature produced was not simply atmospheric detail added by witnesses seeking to give their account more texture. It was something the witnesses breathed, something their bodies responded to with the involuntary mechanisms of genuine toxic exposure, something that the physical evidence of their symptoms made difficult to entirely dismiss as perceptual error or sincere misidentification. The Fallout 76 interpretation of the Flatwoods monster takes the historical encounter's most provocative implication and commits to it completely. The creature that appears in post-war Appalachia is not a biological entity in any sense that the wasteland's usual taxonomy of mutants and cryptids is equipped to process. It is robotic, constructed rather than grown, manufactured rather than born, operating through mechanisms that suggest technological sophistication so far beyond what the pre-war United States was capable of producing, that the question of who built it and for what purpose and under whose authority points in directions that the game's lore acknowledges without resolving. The technology that animates the Flatwoods monster in the game is the technology that the Zetan presence in the Fallout universe carries as its most consistent identifier: sleek, precise, incompatible with any known human engineering tradition, operating according to principles that the available science of the wasteland cannot reverse engineer from the evidence it leaves behind. The hovering that defines the creature's relationship to the Appalachian landscape is its most immediately apparent characteristic and its most philosophically significant one. It does not walk the ground it moves through. It maintains its elevation above the terrain with a consistency that suggests either that contact with the surface would be problematic in ways the creature is designed to avoid, or that the surface is simply irrelevant to its operational requirements, a medium it passes over rather than through. This hovering gives the Flatwoods monster a quality that no other cryptid in the wastelands bestiary possesses, the quality of being genuinely elsewhere while being physically present, of occupying the Appalachian landscape without in any meaningful sense belonging to it, of being visible without being native in the way that even the most extreme mutant is native to the environment that produced it. The tractor beam that the creature deploys in combat, lifting opponents off the ground and suspending them in the same elevated relationship to the terrain that the creature itself maintains, is the most direct expression of this dynamic. The Flatwoods monster's method of engaging with threats is to remove them from the ground that is their natural medium and place them in the condition of groundlessness that is the creature's own permanent state, inverting for a moment the fundamental asymmetry between a thing that hovers and a thing that does not. Whether this is tactical calculation, a default response, or simply the most natural expression of a capability whose primary purpose is something other than combat is unclear, and the creature's behavior, in other respects, does not provide enough information to confidently resolve the question. The mist that the historical Flatwoods encounter produced in 1952, and that the game's creature reproduces in the post-war environment, is the element that most directly connects the Wastelands cryptid to its folkloric predecessor, and its function in the game illuminates what the historical witnesses may have been responding to. The mist causes damage to those who enter it, operating as a chemical hazard that the creature maintains around itself as a perimeter, a buffer zone of environmental hostility between its body and the world that might otherwise approach it. Whether the mist is a defensive weapon, a biological secretion analogous to the chemical defenses of various earth fauna, or a byproduct of the creature's power systems, emitting something into the atmosphere that its designers did not intend as a weapon, but that functions as one, this question, like so many questions about the Flatwoods monster, cannot be resolved with the available evidence. The loneliness of the Flatwoods monster in the post-war landscape is a quality that emerges from the accumulated record of encounters with it in a way that the creature's designers perhaps did not fully anticipate, but that is among the most powerful things about it. It moves through Appalachia without community, without the territorial relationships that define the Mothman's connection to its environment and the other cryptids' connections to theirs, without the worship of a cult or the attention of dedicated researchers who have made its documentation their post-war vocation. It is encountered and then absent, present in a location until it is not, leaving behind the mist and the specific memory of something that should not have been there and that was not sufficiently interested in the landscape to remain. The other cryptids of Appalachia, however strange and however dangerous, feel like inhabitants of their environment, creatures whose presence in the specific geography they occupy makes a kind of sense, even if that sense is difficult to articulate within conventional biological frameworks. The Flatwoods monster feels like a visitor, and a visitor without a destination, following some program whose purpose lies entirely outside the landscape it is currently moving through. The Grafton monster does not require mystery to be disturbing, where the Mothman's power lies in the uncertainty of its nature, and the Flatwoods monster's power lies in the impossibility of its origin. The Grafton monster's power lies in its body, in the specific physical fact of what it is and how it moves, and what its movement represents for anyone in its vicinity who would like to continue existing. It is enormous. It is fast with the specific speed that does not seem congruent with something of its size, the speed that violates the expectation the eye forms about what something so large must necessarily move like. And this violation of expectation is a significant portion of what makes the creature so effective as a predator. By the time the recalibration has occurred, the moment in which the mind recognizes that its initial assessment was wrong, the creature has already closed the distance that the initial assessment had suggested was safe. The pre-war Grafton monster legend was rooted in sightings from the area around Grafton, West Virginia, beginning in the 1960s and clustering in the period that also produced the Mothman sightings, several counties away, as if the particular conditions of that specific period, in that specific region, were generating anomalous biological phenomena with a frequency that the surrounding decades had not matched, and that the available environmental explanations of the time were not equipped to address. The creature described in those sightings was massive, scaly-skinned or smooth-skinned, depending on the account, consistently observed near the Tygart Valley River and its tributaries, and consistently described as headless, in the detail that every subsequent account would preserve, with the emphasis of people who understood that the headlessness was not simply an unusual characteristic, but the creature's defining feature, the thing that organized all other information about it. The headlessness of the Grafton monster is not simply a biological anomaly in the taxonomic sense that any unusual characteristic of an unusual creature represents. It is a cognitive challenge that the creature poses to every human being who encounters it, because the human brain's threat response architecture is organized in ways that place enormous weight on the face of the thing threatening it. We read threat from facial expressions, from eye direction, from the orientation of the head that contains both the sensory organs through which a predator perceives its prey and the communication apparatus through which it might, if the encounter develops in ways that preclude immediate violence, signal its intentions. A creature without a head has none of these features. It cannot be read in the ways that the evolved threat response system is designed to read predators, cannot be appealed to through any of the social signals that have always been humanity's primary alternative to flight when flight is not available. It is simply mass and motion and the specific velocity of something that has already made all relevant decisions before you were aware that any decisions were being made. The Fallout 76 Grafton monster is enormous by the wastelands standards, which is to say, it is enormous by any standard that the pre-war world would have recognized as applicable to biological entities operating in the terrestrial environment. Its skin is pale in the game's rendering, white or grey depending on the light, and the texture of it carries the specific quality of something that has not been designed for the environment it currently occupies, but has proved adequate to it regardless. The body is broad through the torso in ways that suggest musculature organized around a mechanical efficiency rather than a biological elegance, built for the application of force rather than for the conservation of energy that most large terrestrial animals prioritize through their body plans. The absence of a head raises questions about sensory processing that no examination of the creature's behavior has yet resolved. It navigates its environment with sufficient precision to be an effective predator of the wasteland survivors, which means it is detecting and tracking prey with accuracy that requires sensory capabilities beyond the most basic detection of movement and heat. Whether these capabilities are distributed throughout its body, located in structures that have no external visibility from the angles at which it has been most frequently observed, or operate through mechanisms that have no pre-war biological analog, this remains genuinely unknown. The creature's hunting behavior suggests that whatever sensory system it employs is adequate to its predatory requirements, which may be the only operationally relevant conclusion available given the circumstances under which these questions are normally posed. The Tygart Valley River connection that the pre-war Grafton monster legend established and that the game's creature preserves is one of the most carefully chosen details in the design of the Fallout Mothman. The pattern of observation near water sources the river approaches, the tributaries, the flooded areas that post-war Appalachia's altered hydrology has produced in locations where the pre-war landscape maintained dry ground suggests either a dependency on aquatic environments that the creature's biology requires or a hunting strategy oriented toward the concentrated presence of prey species that the water sources of the wasteland attract. The pre-war legend's association with the Tygart Valley River created a geographical specificity that the game has honored, placing the Grafton monster in relationship to Grafton itself in a way that connects the post-war creature to its folkloric predecessor through the specific geography they share, rather than simply through the physical characteristics. that the legend described. The town of Grafton in the game is itself a location of considerable post-war strangeness, governed by an automated protectron that has been fulfilling its pre-war mayoral programming in the absence of the human population that programming was designed to serve, maintaining the routines of civic administration in a community where the community has ceased to exist in any form that civic administration can address. The Grafton monster's presence in and around this already strange location creates a relationship between the creature and the place that the game does not fully articulate, but that exists as a felt quality, as if the monster has claimed the ruins of Grafton as territory in the way that apex predators claim territories, and as if the automated mayor conducting its empty civic duties in the town centre is simply another feature of the environment the monster has decided to inhabit, no more relevant to its purposes than the ruined buildings or the contaminated waterways. The variants that exist within the Grafton monster population are less philosophically significant than the Mothman's variants, but more practically significant for the survivors who encounter them, because the variations that the game documents are variations in size and capability rather than in behavior or apparent cognition, and size and capability in a creature of the Grafton monster's baseline are not trivial variables. The larger specimens represent the specific quality of things that have been given too much time and too many resources and have simply continued to express the growth potential that their biology contains without any of the environmental constraints that normally establish a ceiling on biological scale. These specimens are not more intelligent than the standard variant, not more strategically sophisticated, not possessed of any additional quality beyond the additional mass and the additional force that the additional mass enables. But additional mass in a creature that is already terrifyingly large is its own category of threat, and the encounters documented in the Wastelands archives with the larger Grafton monster specimens are consistently the accounts whose author's handwriting reflects the most acute relationship with their own continued existence. The Grafton monster is the cryptid that makes the fewest concessions to the possibility that its strangeness has a philosophical or spiritual dimension. It is a large, fast, headless creature that kills things and eats them and occupies territory in the ruins of a small West Virginia town and its surrounding waterways. This simplicity is not a limitation but a completeness. The Grafton monster does not need mystery to be extraordinary, does not require theological interpretation or epistemological uncertainty to be more than the wasteland's ordinary inventory of dangerous fauna. It is simply itself, fully and without qualification, and what it is sufficient to make the firelight feel like the most valuable thing in the world to anyone who has seen it moving in the dark toward the river. There is a particular quality of wrongness that belongs to things which appear soft when they are not, that present to the eye a texture associated with gentleness and domesticity while being organized, at every functional level, around the opposite of both. The wool or wool-like material that covers the sheep squatch is this kind of wrongness made biological, the specific dissonance of a covering associated with the most docile of the pre-war domestic animals, appearing on a creature whose relationship to docility is the relationship of fire to water, not simply absent, but definitionally incompatible with everything else the creature is. The white catches the light in the way that soft things catch the light, diffusing it rather than reflecting it, giving the creature in certain conditions of illumination an almost luminescent quality that the survivors of the Appalachian high country have described with consistent unease as the wrong kind of beautiful, the kind that the mind recognizes as bait before the conscious assessment of threat has fully assembled itself. The sheep squatch is not beautiful in any sense that the term's ordinary application would cover. It is large, four-legged, moving through the terrain of the high country with the specific confidence of something that has no reason to be cautious about what it might encounter, because what it might encounter does not represent a meaningful threat to it in any configuration that the post-war Appalachian ecosystem has managed to produce. The ram's horns that define its silhouette against the skyline of the mountain ridges are the second detail that every account of the creature preserves after the whiteness. The horns that curve forward in a configuration that the pre-war sheep whose body plan the creature has inherited, however distantly and however catastrophically, would have been recognized as belonging to a breeding male of sufficient age and vitality to have earned the right to carry them. On the sheep squatch, the horns are not a display, they are a weapon, integrated into a forward-moving assault posture that the creature employs with the mechanical efficiency of something that has spent generations refining exactly this application of exactly this capability. The pre-war legend that the game inherited was specific to the counties of Boone and Putnam in West Virginia, and this specificity is one of the details that distinguishes the sheep squatch from the more nationally famous cryptids of the Appalachian region. The Mothman had achieved a degree of national recognition before the bombs fell that had taken it out of the category of purely regional mythology and placed it in the broader American cultural vocabulary of inexplicable encounters. The sheep squatch had not. It remained a creature of the specific communities where the sightings had been concentrated, known to the people who lived in the terrain where it had been observed and largely unknown beyond that terrain, which gave it a rootedness in its home geography that the more famous cryptids, having been distributed through national media into a broader consciousness, had partially lost. The sheep squatch was not a creature that people came from elsewhere to look for. It was a creature that the people who lived alongside it had learned to account for in the practical management of their daily existence, filing it in the category of things that the high country produced and that required specific behavioral adjustments to coexist with, rather than in the category of things that required philosophical interpretation. This practical relationship with the creature is one of the most distinctive aspects of the sheep squatch's position in the wastelands cryptid hierarchy. The communities of post-war Appalachia that have developed alongside it are not primarily organized around the creature theologically, the way that the children of the Mothman have organized their entire institutional existence around their relationship with the Mothman. They are organized around it practically, the way that pre-war Appalachian communities organized around the presence of large predators, the black bear, the mountain lion, the creatures whose danger was understood as a feature of the landscape rather than as a mystery requiring interpretation. The sheep squatch is dangerous. It moves through specific territories and defends those territories with a thoroughness that makes the territory's borders functionally impermeable to anyone who has not developed specific strategies for either avoiding or navigating. These are survival facts, and the high country communities have responded to them with the survival-oriented pragmatism that characterizes the wasteland's most adaptable populations. The question of the sheep squatch's origins is one that the wasteland's cryptid hunters have approached with the particular intensity they bring to creatures whose biological lineage is both most suggestive and most resistant to conformation. The ovine characteristics, the wool-like covering, the ram's horns, the four-legged body plan that retains enough of the sheep's fundamental structure to make the ancestry legible even through the catastrophic transformation point toward a relationship with the domesticated sheep that the Doddy, pre-war Appalachian communities maintained as part of their agricultural tradition. West Virginia's sheep farming history is specific and long, rooted in the same Scots-Irish cultural traditions that brought the ballads and the specific form of mountain community that the region developed across the 17th and 18th centuries. And the sheep that the region's farms maintained before the war were genuine participants in the local economy and the local ecology in ways that made their descendants' post-war fate a question with direct human relevance. What the FEV and radiation together did to the descendants of those sheep over 2 centuries of exposure is a question that the available biological evidence cannot answer with confidence, and that the theoretical framework of mutation science cannot address with the specificity that the sheep squatch's characteristics demand. The transformation from a domesticated ruminant of relatively modest size and entirely passive behavioral orientation to a creature of the sheep squatch's dimensions and aggression is not simply a matter of scale and temperament. Modification. It represents a reorganization of the animal's fundamental biological priorities, that the mechanisms of radiation-induced mutation, even operating over 2 centuries with the FEV, as an additional vector of biological disruption, would need to explain at a level of detail that the wasteland does not currently possess the scientific infrastructure to investigate. The sheep squatch's horns are not sheep horns enlarged by the same processes that enlarged the rest of the creature. They are weapons, shaped by 2 centuries of selection pressure toward the specific functional configuration that makes them most effective in the specific predatory and territorial contexts where their effectiveness is assessed by survival. The albinism that produces the white coloring is the detail that has generated the most discussion among the wasteland's cryptid researchers, partly because of the practical implications of white coloring for a creature that moves primarily through terrain that is not white, and partly because the connection between the sheep squatch's coloring and its folkloric predecessor's coloring is too precise to be coincidental and too consistent to be dismissed as the kind of detail that gets added to legends. Through embellishment over time, the pre-war sheep squatch was white in the accounts. The post-war sheep squatch is white in the encounters. Whether this represents the preservation of a genuine biological characteristic through 2 centuries of transformation, or a convergent development of albinism in creatures whose lineage is descended from the livestock, the legend, originally described, is a question that the consistency of the detail makes more rather than less difficult to resolve. Because the most parsimonious explanation that the creature is white, because its folkloric predecessor was white, and they share a lineage, requires accepting a continuity of biological inheritance across a transformation so extreme that the inheritance of specific pigmentation characteristics seems like the least of what would need to have been preserved. The specific territories that the sheep squatch maintains in post-war Appalachia are concentrated in the high country in ways that reflect either a preference for the elevation and the specific ecological conditions that the mountains provide, or a pattern of retreat from lower elevation environments where human activity has made territorial maintenance more difficult than the energy expenditure justifies. The high country of West Virginia in the post-war period is genuinely high country in the sense that the bombs and the subsequent environmental disruption have made it, in many areas, more remote from human presence than it was before the war. The infrastructure that connected mountain communities to the broader regional economy having been destroyed without being rebuilt, leaving terrain that the sheep squatch can occupy, with fewer of the territorial challenges from human activity that lower elevation creatures face as a matter of course. In this high country, the sheep squatch is the apex predator in the specific sense that this phrase has always carried not simply the most dangerous creature in an environment, but the creature that most thoroughly defines ecosystem's upper limit of biological capability, the creature around whose presence and behavior the other inhabitants of the environment organize their own behavior in ways that cascade through every level of the ecological structure. The bighorners and the other large fauna of the high country move differently when the sheep squatch has been recently active in an area. The smaller creatures concentrate their activity in the territories that the sheep squatch's presence excludes it from, creating islands of relatively intense, small animal activity in the spaces between the sheep squatch's territories. The terrain itself seems organized around the creature's movement patterns in the way that terrain over generations develops a relationship with its apex predator, the paths most frequently used, worn into the landscape by repetition, the viewpoints from which the creature surveys its territory, becoming identifiable to knowledgeable observers through the accumulated signs of repeated occupation. The survivors who have lived longest in the sheep squatch's territory are people who have developed an intimate knowledge of the creature's patterns that they transmit to new community members with the urgency of information whose practical value is immediate and severe. They know the territory's approximate boundaries in the way of people who have learned them through a combination of deliberate observation and the kind of involuntary education that comes from being in the wrong place at the wrong moment, and having to act before the conscious processing of the situation has fully completed. They know the seasonal variations in territorial behavior, the periods of increased aggression that correspond to whatever reproductive cycle the creature maintains. They know the specific terrain features, the ridge lines, the river crossings, the exposed areas that the creature's white coloring makes it most visible and therefore most avoidable, that allow navigation through the high country at acceptable risk levels. This knowledge is not written down in the systematic way that pre-war biology would have required for the documentation of a species' behavioral ecology. It exists in the form that all survival-critical knowledge exists in the wasteland's most functional communities, as practical wisdom transmitted through direct instruction and narrative example, through the stories told around fires of what happened to people who did not know what the storytellers are now transmitting, through the specific behavioral adjustments that the community's members make automatically and that function as embodied knowledge of a kind that no written record can fully capture. The sheep squatch, in this way, has become part of the high country community's culture in the same way that the most significant features of a landscape become part of the culture of the people who have lived alongside them long enough to stop treating them as external facts and to start treating them as aspects of the world whose characteristics are known and must be accounted for, rather than discovered anew by each generation. The white of it, moving through the grey and brown of the post-war high country, is perhaps the last thing that many people who ventured into the sheep squatch's territory without sufficient knowledge ever saw clearly. The survivors who have come back from such encounters note consistently that the whiteness is the thing that resolves out of the background first, that the specific quality of that colour in that environment operates as a visual paradox, too visible to be easily missed, too wrong in its context to be immediately interpreted correctly. The moment between recognition and response being the moment in which all relevant decisions are made by something that does not wait for the recognition and the response to complete before acting. There is a legend that predates every other creature in this account, that was old before the first European settlers arrived in the mountains where the fallout universe would eventually place it. That carries in its bones the specific cultural weight of a teaching story, rather than simply an observation story, a narrative whose purpose was not primarily to document an encounter, but to communicate a warning about what human beings were capable of becoming under specific conditions of extremity, and what they remained once the becoming was complete. The Wendigo is not the wasteland's most biologically inexplicable cryptid. It is the most morally inexplicable one, the creature whose origin the available evidence most directly connects to a human choice, made under conditions that the wasteland produces with devastating regularity, whose consequences exceed anything the person making the choice could have anticipated at the moment of making it. The indigenous mythology of the Wendigo is older than any single tradition that can be traced to a specific origin point, and is distributed across the cultural traditions of enough distinct communities across the northeastern, north-central portions of North America to have been independently developed rather than simply transmitted from a single source. The consistency of the core elements across traditions that had no continuous contact with each other is itself evidence of something, either that the underlying behavioral observations that the mythology encoded were consistent, enough across different environments to produce consistent narrative responses, or that the traditions were in contact at some point sufficiently early to predate the available historical record, or that the Wendigo legend represents a response to something genuinely encountered by the communities that maintained it, rather than a purely symbolic construction. The mythology describes a spirit or creature associated with the winter, with isolation, with the specific extremity of starvation that the northern winters could produce in communities without sufficient food storage to bridge the gap between autumn and spring, and most centrally, with the act of cannibalism, the consumption of human flesh by a human being as a response to the starvation that the winter's worst moments imposed. The transformation that the mythology describes is not simply metaphorical, not the shorthand for moral corruption that later cultural interpretations sometimes reduced it to. It is presented in the traditions that maintain it as a genuine physical process, a biological change triggered by the specific act under the specific conditions, a change that the person undergoing it cannot reverse and cannot escape, and that progressively removes from them everything that was human, except the form and the hunger that replaces every other human appetite. The Wendigo is always hungry. This is the constant across every tradition that preserves the creature's description. It is hungry in the way that winter is cold, fundamentally and without remainder, and the hunger is for the specific thing that its origin act designated as its food. The Fallout Wendigo is this mythology given flesh in a world where flesh has been so thoroughly reorganized by radiation and the forced evolutionary virus that the mythology's physical transformation mechanism, which the traditions that maintained it described in spiritual terms that the pre-war scientific world would have classified as metaphor, has become a literal, biological process. The creature's appearance is the appearance of the mythology's description, filtered through the wasteland's particular aesthetic of extremity elongated, stretched in the specific way of something that has been extended beyond the proportions that its original form was designed to maintain, the limbs too long, the torso too narrow, the head too large for the neck that supports it, the overall proportions carrying the specific quality of wrongness that comes from a human body plan, subjected to pressures that a human body plan was not designed to accommodate. The elongation is the detail that the Wasteland's Wendigo accounts most consistently emphasize as the thing that transforms a distant sighting from potentially misidentifiable to impossible to mistake. From a distance, the upright posture and the general human body plan, read as human, a survivor moving through the landscape, perhaps in distress, perhaps in need of assistance, or at least of the cautious acknowledgement that the Wasteland's social protocols have developed for managing encounters between strangers. The elongation does not become apparent until the distance closes enough to resolve the proportions, and by the time the proportions are clearly wrong, the distance has often closed enough that the practical implications of the misidentification have become severe. The specific biological mechanism that produces the Wendigo transformation in the Fallout universe is one of the details that the game's lore presents with deliberate incompleteness, acknowledging that the transformation occurs in connection with the consumption of human flesh under specific post-war conditions, without specifying whether the mechanism is purely biochemical, involves the FEV in some configuration that its pre-war research programs did not anticipate, or represents something else entirely, whose operation requires explanatory frameworks that the Wasteland does not yet possess. The incompleteness is appropriate because the Wasteland's actual scientific capacity for investigating transformation mechanisms of this kind is minimal, and the communities where the Wendigo transformation has been observed are not typically communities with the luxury of conducting systematic biological research on the creatures that have recently consumed their members. What is known, through the accumulated accounts rather than through controlled observation, is that the transformation is not immediate. It proceeds through stages that the communities with the most extensive experience of Wendigo activity have learned to recognize, stages that offer a narrowing window of possible intervention before the process advances beyond the point where anything describable as the original person can be accessed. The early stages carry signs that the Wasteland's most experienced observers describe as subtle enough to be missed by people who do not know what they are looking for. Changes in behavior and appetite and social engagement that can be attributed to any number of other causes in an environment where stress and trauma and nutritional deficiency produce behavioral changes as a matter of course. The later stages are unmistakable. By the time the elongation begins to express itself, by the time the hunger begins to direct behavior with the absolute priority that the mythology describes, by the time the creature that was a person has become primarily the thing that the mythology warned against, the window has closed entirely. The Wendigo Colossus represents the question of what happens when the process that produces the standard Wendigo is given additional time and additional resources to express itself. When the transformation continues beyond the stage that the standard variant represents and into a territory that the mythology's original formulations did not anticipate, because the mythology was describing creatures that operated within the constraints of environments that killed them before they could reach the Colossus stage. The post-war environment is different. It is harsh in ways that kill most things, but it is also, for creatures whose biology has been reorganized around the consumption of the specific resource that the wasteland produces in abundance, generous in ways that no pre-war environment could match. The Wendigo Colossus is enormous. It is enormous in the way of something that has simply continued doing what its biology directs it to do for longer than any prior Wendigo has continued, accumulating scale through the same mechanism that accumulates scale in every biological context, sustained access to adequate nutrition over sufficient time, except that the nutrition in question is something that the pre-war world's moral framework identified as the most severe possible violation of the categorical distinction between persons and food. The ethical dimension of the Wendigo that distinguishes it from every other cryptid in this account is not reducible to the simple fact that it was once a person, because the humanity of its origin is, by the time the transformation is complete, a historical rather than a present fact, as relevant to its current nature as the ancestry of the Deathclaw is relevant to the iguana that the Deathclaw's lineage presumably descends from. The ethical weight lies in the transformation process itself, in the specific mechanism by which a person becomes a Wendigo, because that mechanism implicates a choice in ways that the other forms of extreme mutation in the wasteland do not. The ghoul did not choose radiation exposure. The super mutant did not choose FEV immersion. The person who takes the step that initiates the Wendigo transformation is choosing, under conditions of extreme duress that complicate the moral analysis considerably but do not eliminate it, to do the thing that triggers the process, to cross the line that the mythology identified as the line whose crossing transforms the crosser. The communities that have the most sustained experience with Wendigo activity in the wasteland have developed responses to this complexity that reflect the practical necessity of people who cannot afford the luxury of extended ethical deliberation in the moments when the deliberation would be most useful. They have developed protocols for managing the circumstances that most frequently precede the transformation. The isolated survivor, the community facing the specific kind of resource deprivation that makes the worst options seem more thinkable than they would otherwise be. The individual who has been separated from the social structures that normally maintain the behavioral constraints that the mythology's warning was designed to reinforce. These protocols reflect, in their practical structure, the same understanding that the mythology encoded in its supernatural vocabulary, that the Wendigo transformation begins not with a creature, but with a set of conditions, and that addressing the conditions is infinitely preferable to addressing the creature that the conditions produce. The wasteland's most honest quality is its willingness to demonstrate that the worst things human beings do to each other under its conditions are not aberrations from human nature, but extensions of it. And the Wendigo is the most direct biological expression of this demonstration. It is what happens when the circumstances that the wasteland produces the isolation, the deprivation, the removal of the social structures that normally maintain the categorical distinctions between permissible and impermissible, converge in a specific person at a specific moment of sufficient extremity, and when that person's response to the convergence crosses the threshold that the mythology identified because the communities that developed it had seen what happened to the people who crossed it. The wasteland did not invent the Wendigo, It simply removed the conditions that had previously kept the threshold from being crossed with sufficient frequency to produce a stable population. In the high country, where the sheep squatch rules by day, the Wendigo moves at night, and the communities that have learned to account for both have developed the specific relationship with darkness that people develop when darkness contains things whose awareness of them exceeds their awareness of what the darkness contains. The fires are kept burning not because fire is warm, though it is, but because fire is the oldest human response to the specific knowledge that some things in the dark are looking back. There are predators that define their environment by occupying it. By being so thoroughly present in the terrain, they claim that the terrain's other inhabitants organize their behavior around the assumption of the predator's continued presence, even when the predator is not immediately visible. The snallygaster is not this kind of predator. The snallygaster defines its environment not by filling it, but by patrolling it, by moving through a range that no ground-based creature could maintain at comparable speed, by being potentially anywhere within a territory that the aerial perspective its flight provides has made comprehensive in ways that the ground-based territorial predator's perspective never is. The ground-based predator knows its territory from the ground's perspective, with the limited sightlines and the obstructions and the terrain features that block vision and create the concealment that prey animals use to navigate within a predator's territory. The snallygaster knows its territory from above, and from above, the terrain features that create concealment at ground level are simply features visible, mappable. The obstacles that they represent to ground-based observation, revealing from altitude the locations where ground-based prey is most likely to seek refuge. The pre-war snallygaster legend had a different character from the West Virginia cryptids that the Fallout universe inherited alongside it. Originating in the valley country of Maryland and the surrounding region, rather than in the specifically West Virginian geography that the Mothman and the Sheep Squatch and the Grafton Monster claimed as their defining territory. The early 20th century newspaper accounts that most extensively documented the snallygaster described a creature that was as much a product of the journalistic imagination of the period as of any genuine biological observation. A story that spread across regional newspapers with the speed that made good monster stories commercially valuable in the days before broadcast media provided alternative entertainment. The specific characteristics attributed to the creature in those early accounts, the vast wings, the long beak or talons, the vaguely reptilian or avian body plan, were the characteristics of a creature assembled from the cultural vocabulary of the threatening aerial unknown, rather than from specific observation, designed to be frightening in the way that newspaper editors of the period understood their readers to be frightened, rather than in the way that genuine encounters with unknown aerial creatures frightened the people who experienced them. The game's snallygaster is not the newspaper legend. It is the thing that the newspaper legend might have been trying to describe if the people doing the describing had had access to something genuinely unusual, rather than to the commercial incentives of early 20th century sensationalist journalism. Large, winged, primarily airborne, capable of ground-based attacks when the tactical situation makes aerial engagement suboptimal, possessing the specific quality of a predator that has had 2 centuries to refine its approach to an environment that has changed dramatically around it, while its fundamental aerial capabilities have remained the primary variable through which it interacts with that environment. The post-war sky of Appalachia is not the pre-war sky of Appalachia, and the difference matters enormously for a creature whose ecological position depends on the aerial dominance that the post-war sky provides. The aircraft that would have challenged that dominance before the war are gone. The noise and light pollution that would have made the aerial environment more complicated to navigate are gone. The sky above Appalachia in the post-war period is, by the standards of any pre-war aerial predator, an environment of extraordinary opportunity, clean, quiet, largely uncontested, offering sightlines that the pre-war sky's atmospheric complexity and human air traffic had partially obscured. The Snallygaster has been in this environment for 2 centuries, and the 2 centuries show. It moves through the post-war sky with the economy of something that has refined its flight patterns to minimize energy expenditure while maximizing coverage of territory. The adjustments that 2 centuries of selection pressure makes to a flight pattern, being the difference between a creature learning to fly and a creature that has been flying for so long that flight has become the primary language in which it understands its relationship to the world. The nests that it establishes in the high points of the Appalachian landscape, the ridgelines, the exposed cliff faces, the ruins of pre-war structures, whose height above the surrounding terrain made them attractive nesting sites before the structure's human occupants had any opportunity to object, are not simply places the creature returns to for sleep and shelter. They are the anchors of the territorial structure that the creature's aerial patrols maintain, the fixed points from which the patrol routes extend and to which they return, the locations that represent the creature's most sustained investment in the specific terrain it has claimed. The eggs in those nests and the young that hatch from them represent one of the most extensively documented aspects of the Snallygaster's biology in the wasteland's accumulated records of cryptid observation. The creature's reproductive behavior has been observed by survivors who were motivated by the combination of scientific curiosity and the survival-critical need to understand the behavioral patterns of a creature capable of taking prey from the ground without warning, to approach the nesting sites closely enough to observe what they contained. These observations were not uniformly survivable, and the accounts that exist in the Wastelands archives represent the subset of observations whose authors were not caught in the act of conducting them. The Snallygaster defends its nesting sites with the specific intensity of a creature that understands the vulnerability that the nesting site represents, with a ferocity that exceeds even its standard territorial aggression, and that the survivors who have witnessed it describe as qualitatively different from the creature's normal behavior, more focused, less willing to break off engagement at the threshold, where the cost-benefit analysis of continued attack begins to favor disengagement. The young Snallygasters that the nests contain are, in the accounts that have captured them, smaller versions of the adult in the way that aerial predators' young typically are disproportionately large-headed, with the wing development that will eventually be the creature's primary capability, already present but not yet functional, dependent on parental provisioning in a way that the adult's fierce independence entirely conceals. The period of dependence appears to be relatively brief by the standards of large-bodied predators, the young achieving flight capability at an age that reflects the specific selection pressure that aerial predators face. A grounded young Snallygaster is an extremely vulnerable young Snallygaster, and the evolutionary incentive to minimize the duration of ground-based vulnerability is powerful enough to have produced a developmental trajectory that prioritizes flight capability over the extended developmental period that other large predators can afford because their young spend it in concealed nesting sites rather than exposed to every ground-based threat that the Appalachian wasteland maintains. The Snallygaster's approach to prey on the ground is the aspect of its behavior that the wasteland's survivors have studied most intensively, for the obvious reason that understanding the approach is the prerequisite to surviving it. The aerial attack that the creature most frequently employs takes advantage of the specific vulnerability that the ground-based perspective creates, the difficulty of monitoring the sky above with sufficient consistency to detect an approaching aerial predator before the predator has closed to the range where evasion becomes difficult. The Snallygaster approaches from above and typically from the direction of the sun when the sun is available, exploiting the same tactical advantage that aerial predators have exploited for as long as aerial predators have existed, a tactic so effective that it has been independently developed by every significant aerial hunter across every environment where aerial hunting is possible. The sun direction and the altitude combine to make the creature effectively invisible until it is very close. And very close, in the context of a creature moving at the speeds that the snallygaster achieves in a dive, is a range at which the time available for response is measured in fractions of seconds that most survivors do not successfully use. The ones who do survive snallygaster attacks, and who are therefore available to contribute to the accumulated understanding of how surviving one is possible, have almost uniformly done so through one of two mechanisms. Either they were inside substantial cover at the moment of the attack, which transformed the encounter from an aerial strike into a ground-level engagement where the snallygaster's advantages are considerably reduced, or they had sufficient warning from some combination of their own skyward vigilance and the behavioral cues that the approach of a snallygaster produces in the local fauna. The fauna of the Appalachian High Country has been living alongside the snallygaster for 2 centuries and has developed through exactly the selection pressure that 2 centuries of being snallygaster prey provides a suite of behavioral responses to the creature's approach that the observant human survivor can read as early warning. When the birds stop flying and the smaller animals disappear into whatever cover the immediate environment provides, and a specific quality of stillness settles over an area that had been normally active, the experienced Appalachian survivor does not pause to consider whether this stillness has a mundane explanation. The snallygaster represents the wasteland's most direct demonstration of what the removal of human air power does to the ecological dynamics of a region where human air power had previously been one of the primary forces limiting what aerial predators could achieve. The pre-war sky was contested in ways that constrained every non-human aerial entity's use of it by the noise, the traffic, the artificial lighting, the simple, persistent human presence that made the airspace above human settlements inhospitable to predatory activity. The post-war sky has been returned, in the most brutal possible way, to the condition that it maintained before the internal combustion engine and the aviation industry and the elaborate infrastructure of modern air travel made it something that human civilization used rather than something that human civilization merely lived beneath. In that returned sky, the snallygaster is what the apex aerial predator looks like, when 2 centuries of evolution in an environment of extraordinary opportunity has had the time to fully express what aerial predation can become, when nothing on the ground has the capacity to seriously contest it. The sound of its wings, described in the accounts that have captured it as deeper and slower than any bird's, and carrying a specific quality of displacement that the listeners recognize as much through the body as through the ear, is the last warning that many of the wasteland survivors have received. The ones who heard it and understood what it meant in time to act are the ones who passed the understanding on. The ones who heard it and did not understand, or who understood too late, are part of a different kind of account, the kind that the communities left behind tell as cautionary narrative, as the specific form of knowledge that the wasteland transmits most urgently, because its value is measured in the lives of the people who did not have it when they needed it. There are things in the deep water that were old before the first human being stood on the bank and looked down and wondered what the darkness below the surface contained. This is not metaphor. The geological record of the Appalachian region is among the oldest in North America. The mountains themselves, the remnants of a range that formed before the era of the dinosaurs, and that has been worn by time, from the sharp peaks that characterized its original formation into the rounded forms that the pre-war landscape presented, the product of so many hundreds of millions of years of patient erosion that the stone itself carries a quality of temporal depth that the human mind is not naturally equipped to process. The rivers that run through this ancient landscape have been running through it, in one form or another, for periods of time that make the entire span of human civilization seem like an afternoon. Whatever lives in those rivers has had all of that time to become what it is, and the ogre is something that has used the time well. The pre-Columbian and early settler accounts that preserved the ogre legend were not accounts of a creature newly encountered, but of a creature long known, something that the communities of the Greenbrier River Valley and surrounding areas had been living alongside for generations before the first systematic attempts to document regional natural history were made. The indigenous traditions that included the Ogwa in their understanding of the river environment treated it with the specific respect that long acquaintance with a genuinely powerful presence produces, not the fearful fascination of something recently discovered, but the careful acknowledgement of something whose characteristics and habits had been observed over sufficient time to be understood in practical terms. The early settler accounts that described large turtle-like creatures in the rivers of the Greenbrier Valley were building on this existing tradition rather than originating it, adding the specific vocabulary of European natural history to observations that the communities already living in the region had been making in their own vocabulary for considerably longer. The turtle is the right ancestral form, if ancestry is the right concept for understanding the relationship between the Ogwa and the Chelonian lineage that its body plan most closely resembles. Turtles are the most ancient of the major reptile groups, having appeared in the fossil record before the dinosaurs and having survived the extinction event that ended the dinosaurs' dominance of the terrestrial environment with the same placid persistence that characterizes their relationship to every environmental challenge that geological time has placed in front of them. The turtle does not adapt in the dramatic way of animals, whose survival depends on rapid behavioral and physical flexibility. It persists, maintaining a body plan that has proved sufficient across a range of environmental conditions so broad that the conditions the Ogwa now faces, the contaminated waterways, the elevated radiation levels, the changed ecosystem that the bombs produced, represent, in the context of what the Chelonian lineage has already weathered, a relatively modest revision of the terms under which survival must be achieved. The Fallout 76 Ogwa is what the turtle body plan looks like after 2 centuries of the specific environmental conditions that post-war Appalachia has produced. And what it looks like is something that the turtle's pre-war representatives would be recognizable as the ancestors of. However distant those ancestors now seem, the shell is the defining feature, as it has always been the defining feature of the Chelonian form. But the Ogwa's shell has achieved dimensions that the pre-war turtle's shell represented only as a theoretical possibility, a scale of armoring that transforms the structure from a biological feature of a living animal into something that the eye processes as geological before it processes it as anatomical. The shell of the largest Ogwa specimens is not simply large, it is a landscape feature, a curved horizon of layered material that the creatures beneath it carry through the rivers of Appalachia with the specific indifference of things that have not needed to be concerned about what their environment might do to them in longer than any available human record extends. The weight of that shell represents a logistical challenge that the Ogwa's biology has solved through the same mechanism that the Chelonian lineage has always used to solve it, the application of sufficient muscular mass to the biology. Problem of moving a structure whose mass would be immobilizing for any body plan, less specifically organized around managing it. The Ogwa moves in water with a fluidity that the shell's dimensions make seem implausible until the specific hydrodynamic properties of the shell's shape are understood. The curved surface that deflects water rather than resisting it, allowing a creature of the Ogwa's scale to achieve movement through the rivers of Appalachia with an efficiency that ground-based locomotion could never match. On land, the Ogwa is slower and more deliberate, the full mass of the shell expressing itself through the terrain in ways that leave impressions in soft ground that the wastelands survivors have learned to read as evidence of recent Ogwa activity, not tracks in the race. Conventional sense of a predator's footprints, but compressions in the riverbank mud, whose scale indicates that something of considerable size has recently passed over or rested on the surface they mark. The question of individual age is the one that the cryptid researchers who have dedicated the most attention to the ogwa, return to with the consistency of people who have found in a single question the most complete expression of what makes a subject fascinating. The largest specimens of the ogwa that have been documented in the post-war period are large enough that their scale significantly exceeds what 2 centuries of post-war growth could account for if the creature's pre-war representatives were of the size that the historical accounts described. Something in the biology of the ogwa, in the specific combination of the Chelonian lineage's already extraordinary longevity and whatever the post-war environment has done to the metabolic processes that determine how long the creatures live, has produced individuals whose size suggests ages that the available framework for biological age estimation cannot accommodate without considerable revision of its assumptions. The pre-war turtle's lifespan is already extraordinary by the standards of most vertebrate life, with documented individuals of certain species reaching ages that exceed 1.5 centuries, while showing few of the degenerative physical changes that comparable ages produce in mammals. If the ogwa's post-war biology has extended this already exceptional longevity through the same mechanisms of metabolic alteration that the wastelands radiation and FEV exposure have applied to so many other biological systems, then some of the ogwa specimens moving through Appalachia's rivers may be individuals who were already established members of their environment before the bombs fell, who experienced the Great War as an event rather than as the definition of the world they were born into, who have continued through the 2 centuries of post-war environmental change with the same patient persistence that their lineage has brought to every previous environmental challenge. This possibility that some of what the wasteland survivors are encountering in the rivers of Appalachia are animals who remember, in whatever form biological memory takes in creatures of the ogwa's cognitive organization, a world that the human survivors know only through pre-war records, and the accounts of the very oldest ghouls, is one that the wasteland's cryptid community has not fully processed in terms of its implications. The wasteland is defined for the human survivors who constitute its primary community of consciousness by its relationship to the catastrophe that created it. Every aspect of the wasteland's social and cultural and institutional life is organized around the event of October 23, 2077. As the horizon behind which the meaningful past lies and the event from which the meaningful present extends, the ogwa potentially does not share this organizational framework. For a creature old enough to predate the catastrophe is an event in the middle of a life rather than the beginning of a world, and the continuity of existence that extends on both sides of it represents a relationship to time that the human survivors can contemplate but cannot experience. The rivers that the ogwa inhabits in the post-war period are not the rivers of the pre-war landscape, and the ogwa's continued successful inhabitation of them is itself evidence of a biological resilience that the Chelonian lineage's long history suggested was possible, but that the specific severity of post-war Appalachian environmental conditions made far from guaranteed. The waterways of West Virginia had been subject to significant industrial contamination before the bombs, the coal mining and chemical manufacturing industries that had defined the regional economy for a century had left behind. Contamination loads that the environmental regulations of the pre-war period were inadequate to address, and that the environmental degradation of the post-war period had dramatically compounded. The rivers that the ogwa moves through carry contamination that would be immediately and severely harmful to most biological systems, that has transformed the aquatic ecosystems of the region into something bearing only partial resemblance to the pre-war aquatic ecology that the ogwa's ancestors inhabited. The ogwa is not unaffected by these conditions. The mutations that post-war environmental exposure has produced in the creature are visible in the specific ways that 2 centuries of radiation and chemical contamination leave marks on biological systems. The coloration of the procrests, shell carrying the specific palette of prolonged heavy metal and radiation exposure, the texture of the exposed skin showing the changes that contaminated water contact produces over sufficient time, the overall biological condition of the creature, reflecting an environment that is hostile in ways that the creature's extraordinary resilience manages rather than eliminates. But managed is the operationally significant word. The ogwa is present in rivers that other large vertebrates have abandoned, occupying ecological positions that the contamination has vacated by eliminating less resilient competitors. Its persistence in these environments, a demonstration of biological capability that the pre-war turtle's impressive resilience only partially predicted. The communities that live along the rivers where ogwa activity has been most consistently documented have developed a relationship with the creature that reflects the long-term coexistence that the creature's pre-war presence in the regional mythology suggests predates the bombs by considerable time. These communities do not hunt the ogwa, not because the attempt would be futile against a creature of the ogwa's scale and armor, though this practical consideration is not irrelevant, but because the specific quality of the creature's presence in their environment has accumulated through the generations of observation that the mythology represents, a weight of significance that makes the ogwa less a resource to be exploited and more a feature of the landscape to be acknowledged and accounted for. The oldest members of the river communities speak of the ogwa in terms that reflect this long acquaintance, describing its presence in the water with the same tone they use to describe the river itself as something that was there before them and will be there after, whose existence is not contingent on anything that the human community does or does not do, whose persistence is the most reliable constant in an environment where reliability of any kind is precious. The shell endures. The rivers carry it downstream and upstream with the patience of geological time expressed in biological form, and the wasteland moves around it in the specific way that the world moves around things that have decided, through the exercise of an evolutionary will that makes conscious decision seem like a pale imitation, to continue. The place called Dunwich has a quality that the wasteland's other locations do not share, a quality that the people who have spent time within its boundaries describe with the specific vocabulary of people who have encountered something for which their available language is inadequate. They say it feels wrong. They say the wrongness is not the wrongness of physical danger, though physical danger is present in abundance, but something more fundamental, a wrongness that precedes the specific threats, and that would be present even if those specific threats were removed, a quality of the place itself, rather than of what the place currently contains. They say that the visions begin before they are aware that anything unusual is happening, arriving not as dramatic hallucinations with clear boundaries between the imagined and the real, but as subtle displacements of perception, as the feeling that the stone they are looking at has always been the stone they are looking at and has never been, in all the time it has existed, any other stone, which is an ordinary enough thought, until the accompanying sense of how long the stone has existed begins to make itself felt. The Dunwich locations of the Fallout universe are spread across multiple games and multiple regions. The Dunwich building of the capital wasteland in Fallout 3, the Dunwich borers of the same region. The various locations bearing the Dunwich name or connected to the Dunwich Borers Corporation that appear in the broader lore as markers of a specific institutional history whose full extent the available records do not reveal. What they share, across games and regions, and the considerable distance that separates the capital wasteland from other territories where Dunwich influence is documented, is the quality that their visitors describe with that vocabulary of fundamental wrongness, the sense of a presence that the locations mediate rather than generate, something that exists below the surface of the landscape, and that the Dunwich infrastructure, whether by accident or by design, has been placed directly above. The Dunwich Borers Corporation's pre-war activities were mining operations in the official documentation that its public filings and corporate records preserve. The company extracted materials from the earth with the equipment and the methodology of an industrial enterprise operating in the regulatory environment of the final years of pre-war America, which is to say, with the thoroughness and the indifference to environmental consequence that characterized the resource extraction industries of that period. The quarry operations that the Dunwich borers conducted at their most significant sites went deeper than the ore bodies that the official extraction rationale would have required access to, deeper than the mining economics of the period would have justified on purely commercial grounds, into geological strata whose composition the available drilling records describe in terms that the geological lexicon of the pre-war period provides, but that carry, in context, implications that the lexicon was not designed to communicate. The materials that the Dunwich borers' deeper operations encountered at the lowest accessible levels of their primary sites are not described in the official records that survive. The official records stop at the point where the description would have required acknowledging what the operations had found, replaced by documentation gaps and classification markings, and the specific administrative silence that organizations use when the honest record would be more damaging than no record at all. What fills the gap is the evidence of what happened to the people who worked at those levels, the behavioral changes documented in medical records, the psychological deterioration observed by supervisors and co-workers and family members, the specific quality of the disturbances reported by workers who spent extended periods in the lowest operational areas. These records are not complete. They were not intended to be made available to anyone outside the organization's most senior management. They survive because the bombs preserved everything that was sealed inside reinforced structures, including the things that their creators would have preferred to destroy. The obelisk that exists at the Dunwich sites is the element that most directly connects the pre-war industrial operations to whatever the operations were actually accessing. It is old in the way that very few manufactured objects are old, carrying the specific quality of antiquity that distinguishes things that were made a long time ago from things that have simply been in place a long time. The difference between an artifact and a ruin, between something that was put there with intention and something that the passage of time has left where it was. The obelisk predates the Dunwich Corporation. It predates the settlement of the region by European colonists. It may predate the indigenous communities who were present when those colonists arrived, its origin lying in a period that the available archaeological record of the region does not yet fully illuminate. It is marked with symbols that the pre-war scholarship on the Dunwich sites could not definitively attribute to any known ancient culture, a failure of attribution that is either an honest acknowledgement of scholarly uncertainty or evidence that the symbols belong to a tradition whose existence the scholarly record does not currently contain. The rituals. The evidence that the Dunwich sites were the locations of deliberate ritual activity, conducted with sufficient regularity and sufficient organization to leave physical evidence that the wasteland's most thorough investigators have documented, is among the most deeply unsettling aspects of the Dunwich locations for the people who have studied them carefully, not because ritual activity in the service of belief systems that differ from the investigator's own is inherently concerning, which it is not, but because the specific character of what the ritual evidence documents, the arrangements, the offerings, the specific modifications to the site's physical environment that deliberate ceremonial use over an extended period produces, suggests a set of beliefs about what the ritual was communicating with that is not consistent with any religious tradition that the pre-war world formally recognized, and a set of responses from whatever the ritual was communicating with that the physical evidence at the sites implies were, at least occasionally, received. The ghouls and mirelurks and other biological entities that inhabit the Dunwich locations display behavioral and physical characteristics that distinguish them from their counterparts in sites without the Dunwich connection. This distinction is subtle enough that casual observation might not catch it, but the investigators who have spent the most time at the Dunwich sites and the most time at comparable sites without the Dunwich history consistently note it with the confidence of people who have looked long enough to trust their Perception. The creatures at Dunwich are not simply more dangerous than their counterparts elsewhere, though many of them are. They are different in ways that the vocabulary of increased aggression or enhanced mutation does not fully capture, different in the specific quality of their awareness, in the way they occupy space, in the sense that they are in some relationship with the environment they inhabit that goes beyond the territorial and predatory relationships that define every other creature's connection to its location. The visions that come at the deepest accessible levels of the Dunwich sites are the element whose significance the wastelands investigators debate most extensively, because the visions raise the question of mechanism in a way that the other anomalous features of the Dunwich locations do not. Physical evidence can be attributed to physical causes, even when the specific cause is unknown. The behavioral changes in the creatures can be attributed to environmental factors, even when those factors resist identification. But visions, experiences whose content is not determined by the physical environment in which they occur, that arrive with a specificity and a consistency across different observers in the same locations that makes purely individual psychological explanation insufficient, require a different category of mechanism, one that the available science of the wasteland is not equipped to address, and that the available science of the pre-war world was not equipped to address either. The content of the visions is the detail that the accounts of Dunwich visitors most consistently preserve, and the content is not random in the way that hallucination is random. It is organized, sequential, in a way that suggests narrative rather than projection, concerned with geological time, in a way that reflects actual geological time, rather than the human mind's typically compressed sense of deep duration. People who spend time at the lowest levels of the Dunwich sites see things that the surface world does not contain, things that the surface world has not contained for periods whose measurement requires the vocabulary of geology, rather than history, things whose awareness of the people seeing them is the most disturbing aspect of the visions, because awareness implies a relationship rather than simply an observation. The Lovecraftian tradition that the Dunwich material explicitly invokes is not simply a reference, not simply a designer's acknowledgement of a literary heritage that the names and the atmosphere evoke. It is an engagement, a decision to take seriously, within the Fallout universe's broader commitment to the proposition that the world contains more than the available science has so far been asked to address. The possibility that, beneath the atomic horror, there exists a more fundamental horror, whose nature is not destruction but indifference, not malevolence but scale so vast that malevolence and benevolence are equally irrelevant categories. Not the darkness that the bombs produced, but the darkness that was there before the first light was struck, and that will be there when the last fire goes out. The wasteland's cryptid taxonomy has a limit, and Dunwich is where that limit is. Everything else in this account can be placed, however imperfectly, within frameworks that begin with the observable world and extend from there through the mechanisms of mutation and evolution and biological transformation that the wasteland has demonstrated are capable of producing things far outside the Kama pre-war world's expectations. The Dunwich presence cannot be placed within these frameworks because it does not originate in them. It originates somewhere below them, in whatever the geological strata contain that the obelisk marks and the corporation's drilling operations were designed to access, in whatever was receiving the communications that the ritual evidence implies were being sent. The visions are its answer. The wrongness that the location carries is its presence. What it is and what it wants are questions that the available vocabulary was not designed to ask, and that the available experience was not designed to answer. The night sky of the wasteland is different from the night sky of the pre-war world in one of the few ways that favors the people looking up at it rather than threatening them. The atmospheric pollution and the artificial lighting that characterized the pre-war environment had dimmed the stars for most of human civilization's most technologically advanced period, stealing from the people living in that period the clear view of the galaxy that their ancestors had considered as ordinary as the ground beneath their feet. The bombs that ended the pre-war world also ended the light pollution and the atmospheric haze that had dimmed the stars, and the wasteland survivors look up at a sky that their great-grandparents would have traveled to remote wilderness to see. The stars are extraordinary. They are present in numbers and with a clarity that makes the sky feel lower and closer than the pre-war sky had felt. The Milky Way visible on clear nights as the river of light that its name has always described. Among those stars, some of what moves is not a star. Some of what the wasteland's survivors observe in the night sky, moving in patterns that the stars do not follow, maintaining positions and trajectories that no natural astronomical object would maintain, is something that arrived rather than formed, that is present in the sky above the wasteland, not because the processes that produce stars and planets placed it there, but because something brought it there for purposes that have never been fully disclosed to the inhabitants of the world it is orbiting. The Zetan presence in the Fallout universe is not, strictly speaking, a mystery in the way that the Mothman is a mystery, or the Dunwich presence is a mystery. It is confirmed. The physical evidence of Zetan activity, the alien blasters found in crash sites across multiple regions of the wasteland, the abduction records preserved in the specimens and documentation aboard Mothership Zeta, the biological modifications that Zetan experimentation has produced in subjects retrieved from their orbital facility, constitutes the kind of physical proof that the wasteland's more ambiguous cryptid phenomena do not provide. The Zetans are real, their spacecraft are real, their biological research programs are real. The question that their presence poses is not whether they exist, but what they are doing and have been doing and intend to do. And this question has proved no more tractable than the existence question would have been if the physical evidence had not resolved it. Mothership Zeta, the enormous orbital platform that the Fallout 3 downloadable content placed above the capital wasteland, is the most extensive documentation of Zetan operations available in the wasteland's accumulated record. The craft is vast in the way of things that were built without the weight and fuel constraints that terrestrial engineering has always imposed on human construction, organized according to a spatial logic that reflects priorities and assumptions sufficiently different from human architectural principles to be disorienting for the human mind, attempting to navigate it without a framework for understanding what each section is for and why it is where it is. The biological research facilities that occupy a significant portion of the accessible areas contain specimens from across the full temporal range of Zetan operations in Earth's atmosphere, abductees from periods extending back through American history with a consistency that demonstrates the operations have been ongoing for far longer than any post-war record extends, that the Zetans were observing and collecting and experimenting long before the bombs fell, and long before the specific anxieties of the nuclear age gave humanity a new set of reasons to look at the sky with suspicion. The specimens themselves are among the most affecting aspects of Mothership Zeta for the survivors who have managed to reach and explore it, because the specimens are people, or were people. Their preservation in the craft's stasis systems, maintaining them in a condition that the mind, encountering them, processes as sleeping rather than dead, even when the duration of their preservation makes sleep a metaphor rather than a description. They are people from different periods, preserved with the care that the research programs that collected them require the care of a laboratory for its materials, rather than the care of a community for its members, which is the most precise possible statement of the relationship the Zetans have maintained with the human beings they have been collecting across the centuries. The biological experiments that the Zetan research programs have conducted on their human subjects represent the most advanced application of the same impulse that the Enclave's FEV research expressed, and that the Wasteland's other experimental programs embodied in their various ways, the impulse to understand the mechanisms of biological life by doing things to living biological subjects that the subject's own interests would preclude if the subjects' interests were relevant to the calculation. The Zetan experiments exceed the enclaves in both sophistication and duration, having been refined across a temporal span that makes the enclave's programs seem like preliminary sketches. The modifications they have produced in the subjects whose records survive in Mothership Zeta's data systems are not random or chaotic in the way that experimentation, without adequate knowledge, sometimes produces random results. They are systematic, building on each series of experiments toward objectives that the available data implies are clear to the researchers conducting them, and that remain, for the human investigators who have accessed those records, comprehensible as specific research programs whose methods are documentable even when their ultimate purposes remain obscure. The crash sites that are distributed across the wasteland's geography are the most accessible physical evidence of Zetan presence for the survivors who lack the means to reach the orbital platform, and they are numerous enough to establish that the operations being conducted above the wasteland involve a fleet rather than a single vehicle, that the aerial activity that the crash sites represent has been frequent enough and sustained enough over a sufficient period to produce multiple failures of the quality that leaves behind the wreckage the crash sites contain. The alien blasters recovered from these sites are, by the standards of the wasteland's weapons inventory, extraordinary, not simply more powerful than the most powerful conventional weapons available, but differently powerful, operating on principles that the wasteland's gunsmiths have been unable to reverse engineer in 2 centuries of access to the recovered examples, suggesting that the gap between Zetan technology and the most advanced human technology is not a gap of degree, but of kind. The connection between the Flatwoods monster and the Zetan presence is the thread that connects the alien presence to the cryptid tradition that this account has been tracing. The element that places the Zetans not simply in the category of confirmed extraterrestrial intelligence, but in the specific category of the wasteland's cryptids, things that exceed the available explanatory frameworks, that are present in the landscape without being native to it, that leave behind evidence of their passage without providing the context that would make that evidence interpretable. The Flatwoods monster's technology is Zetan technology, or technology sufficiently similar to Zetan technology that the distinction, if any distinction exists, is smaller than the gap between both and anything the pre-war human world was capable of producing. Its presence in Appalachia specifically, in the region where the historical 1952 sighting that gave it its name was associated with a light in the sky, connects the game's post-war creature to a pre-war event that the Zetan operations timeline places within the normal range of Zetan activity over North America. The Zetans, as the ultimate cryptid, is the framing that the accumulated evidence most supports, and it is the framing that most completely encompasses what makes the cryptid phenomenon significant in the wasteland's broader landscape of strange and dangerous things. The cryptid is defined not by its physical characteristics, but by its relationship to the available frameworks, by its capacity to exceed those frameworks in ways that make them inadequate rather than simply incomplete, by the specific quality of incomprehensibility that it maintains, even when it is physically present and materially real. The Zetans are physically present and materially real. Their spacecraft are in orbit. Their weapons are in the wasteland. Their biological modifications are in the bodies of their research subjects, and yet they remain, in every meaningful sense, incomprehensible, their motivations unknown, their long-term intentions undisclosed. Their relationship to the wasteland they have been observing for centuries, defined by the same quality of detachment from the welfare of the observed that the Dunwich presence suggests from a different direction. They are watching from the sky in the way that the Dunwich presence is present from below, and the wasteland, between these two attentions, the cosmic indifference above and the geological antiquity below, is where the people who survived the bombs are building whatever comes next. The stars that the survivors look up at on clear nights include things that are not stars, things that move with the specific quality of observation rather than orbit. that maintain positions above the landscape with the patience of something that has been watching long enough to have developed opinions about what it is watching, and that has not yet disclosed those opinions to the people being watched. The campfire is the right response to this knowledge, not because it protects against what the sky contains, but because it represents the specifically human refusal to simply accept the darkness on its own terms, to sit in the awareness of what is out there and nevertheless maintain the light, to be small and known and watched, and to build a fire anyway, because the fire is what we have and what we are and what we have always done when the dark has contained things larger than ourselves. There is a particular kind of courage that belongs to curiosity rather than to combat, that expresses itself not in the willingness to fight dangerous things, but in the willingness to approach them with a notebook rather than a weapon, to prioritize understanding over survival in the specific moments when the two priorities are in direct competition. The wasteland produces very little of this kind of courage, not because the wasteland survivors lack intellectual capacity or genuine desire to understand the world they inhabit, but because the wasteland's conditions consistently and ruthlessly penalize the diversion of attention from immediate survival toward longer-term knowledge accumulation. A person who stops to carefully observe a Grafton monster's behavioral patterns rather than immediately retreating to the maximum distance that the terrain allows is a person whose contribution to the wasteland's understanding of Grafton monster behavior may be their last. The selection pressure against curiosity in the wasteland is severe, and the people who maintained it anyway, who decided that the documentation of what the post-war environment had produced was worth the additional risk that documentation required, occupy a specific and important place in the wasteland's human history. The cryptid hunters of Appalachia were these people. They were not a unified organization in the formal sense that the Brotherhood of Steel or the Enclave or the various institutional remnants of the pre-war world constituted organizations, with hierarchies and charters and formal membership criteria and the accumulated resources that institutional continuity provides. They were individuals and small groups connected by shared interest and occasional collaboration, by the exchange of notes and observations through the informal networks of the wasteland's survivor communities, by the mutual recognition that what they were doing was both important and unlikely to be recognized as such, by the communities whose immediate survival concerns left little room for valuing knowledge that did not directly address the most pressing practical problems of daily existence. Their records survive in the terminals and holotapes and handwritten journals that the wasteland preserves with the indiscriminate thoroughness of a catastrophe that sealed everything it did not incinerate. And reading those records is the closest thing available to understanding what it meant to be someone who chose, in the specific conditions of post-war Appalachia, to make the documentation of the impossible their primary vocation. The methodology that the most systematic of the cryptid hunters employed was a genuine attempt to apply pre-war scientific rigor to a subject that pre-war science would not have recognized as legitimate, and the tension between the rigor and the subject produces records that are among the most intellectually interesting in the Wasteland's documentary archive. They established observation protocols, recording conditions and duration and distance and weather, and the specific behavioral sequences they observed with the consistency of people who understood that a single observation, however dramatic, is not evidence of anything that a skeptical audience can be asked to accept. They attempted to triangulate sightings across multiple observers, comparing accounts to identify the consistent details that genuine encounters produce and the inconsistent details that embellishment and misidentification introduce. They argued with each other, sometimes bitterly, about whether specific sightings were of the same creature or different creatures, about whether the behavioral patterns one researcher had documented contradicted or complemented the patterns another had observed, about the fundamental interpretive question of what it meant that the creatures they were studying behaved in ways that the available biological frameworks could not fully account for. The debates about the Mothman are the most extensively documented of these arguments, reflecting both the Mothman's status as the region's most significant and most widely observed cryptid and the genuine difficulty of the interpretive questions the creature poses. The disagreement between the researcher who maintained through decades of systematic sighting documentation that the Mothman's appearances correlated with subsequent disastrous events at a rate too high to be explained by chance, and the researcher who argued with equal conviction that this correlation was an artifact of the specific way that the human mind processes patterns in conditions of elevated anxiety, was a genuine scientific dispute rather than simply a difference of belief, a dispute whose resolution would require either the statistical tools that the wasteland did not have access to or a controlled experimental design whose implementation was obviously impossible, given that the variable in question was the approach of catastrophic events. Neither researcher definitively won the argument. Both produced records that the communities who inherited them found valuable for different reasons. The documentation of the Flatwoods monster presented different methodological challenges because the creature's technological character, the hovering, the tractor beam, the mist, whose chemical composition the researchers most interested in its properties could not analyze without laboratory equipment, that post-war Appalachia did not maintain, exceeded the observational toolkit that the cryptid hunters had developed for studying biological entities. The researcher who spent the most sustained period attempting to document the Flatwoods monster's movement patterns and territorial behavior left behind records that are distinguished by a specific quality of intellectual frustration, the notes of someone who understood that what they were observing required frameworks they did not possess, and who continued observing anyway, because the alternative was leaving the documentation to no one. Their final holotape, recorded from a position they describe as uncomfortably close to a Flatwoods monster that had become aware of their presence, ends abruptly. The terminal entries that follow it, made by a different hand, document the search that was conducted and its outcome with the specific brevity of people who had found what they were looking for and did not want to spend more words on it than the facts required. The toll of cryptid hunting in post-war Appalachia is documented in these transition moments, in the abrupt endings of holotapes and journals, in the entries made by other hands, in records that began in a single voice, in the notes that experienced hunters added to the files of those who had not come back from expeditions, whose last recorded entries describe getting closer than was wise to creatures that the hunters knew were dangerous and were approaching anyway, because the documentation required proximity, and the documentation was the point. These records carry the specific weight of people who understood the risk they were accepting and accepted it because the alternative was leaving the wasteland's most significant biological phenomena unexamined. Because someone needed to be close enough to see clearly, and they had decided, each of them, that they were willing to be that someone. The diversity of backgrounds that the cryptid hunting community contained reflects the wasteland's broader social diversity, the range of origins and educations and prior vocations that the catastrophe compressed into the single category of survivor, producing communities where a pre-war biology professor and a pre-war coal miner might find themselves engaged in the same project for the first time in their respective lives, bringing different tools and different perspectives to the shared question of what the post-war environment had produced. Some of the cryptid hunters had genuine pre-war scientific training, their methodology reflecting the education that universities and research institutions had provided before the bombs eliminated both. Others had no formal scientific background, but had developed through years of practical necessity a quality of systematic observation that their formally trained colleagues found more valuable than the academic rigor that their own training emphasized at the expense of the field skills that academic science rarely required. The field skills mattered enormously. The ability to move through terrain inhabited by the sheepsquatch without triggering the territorial response that movement through that terrain typically produced was not a skill that pre-war biology programs taught, because pre-war biology programs had not anticipated a world in which the organism you were studying was capable of moving toward you at the speed the sheep-squatch achieved, and across terrain that the sheep-squatch's four-legged high-country body plan navigated considerably better than any biped. The cryptid hunters, who survived longest in active documentation work, were consistently people who combined whatever intellectual framework they brought to the work with the practical wilderness skills that Appalachia had always rewarded. In the people who took it seriously as a landscape rather than simply as a setting for the activities they had come there to conduct. The relationship between the cryptid hunting community and the children of the Mothman is one of the more philosophically productive tensions in the wasteland's intellectual history, a sustained disagreement between two communities who shared a subject of intense interest while maintaining fundamentally different frameworks for understanding what that subject meant and what the appropriate response to it was. The cryptid hunters, in their more secularized approach, viewed the children's theology as both a genuine cultural response to real encounters with the Mothman and a systematic impediment to the kind of dispassionate observation that they believed the creature required. The children, for their part, viewed the cryptid hunters' insistence on secular explanation as a failure of perception rather than a methodological virtue, as the imposition of a pre-war framework onto a post-war phenomenon that the pre-war framework was specifically designed to exclude. Both communities produced valuable records. The children's systematic documentation of Mothman sightings and their correlation with subsequent events, maintained with the institutional consistency that religious organizations bring to their most important practices, constitutes the most extensive temporal record of Mothman activity available in the wasteland. The cryptid hunters' behavioral documentation, produced at closer range and with greater attention to the specific physical characteristics and movement patterns that theological interpretation tends to overlook in favor of the meaning of the encounter, fills in the observational gaps that the children's records, oriented toward the pattern of appearances rather than the details of the creature itself, consistently leave open. Together, the two bodies of documentation produce a portrait of the Mothman that neither community could have produced alone, which is itself a meaningful observation about the relationship between different kinds of attention and the understanding that each kind makes possible. The Cryptid Festival of Point Pleasant, which the pre-war community had maintained as an annual celebration of its most famous resident phenomenon, and which the post-war community attempted to revive in various forms as the settlement of the region's ruins progressed, represents the intersection of all these different modes of engagement with the wasteland's cryptid population in a single cultural institution. The festival was, in its pre-war form, simultaneously sincere and commercial, serving the genuine believers who organized their understanding of the regional landscape around the cryptids they documented, and the tourists and curious observers who came from outside the region to engage with the mythology from a comfortable distance. The post-war attempts to revive it were necessarily different in character, organized not around the comfortable distance of tourism, but around the practical necessity of communities who needed to share information about the creatures they were living alongside, and who had found, in the festival's tradition, a framework for doing so that carried the additional benefit of cultural continuity with the world the bombs had ended. The legacies that the cryptid hunters left behind are distributed through the wasteland in the specific way that the legacies of people who worked in isolation without institutional support tend to be distributed unevenly, incompletely, preserved where the specific circumstances of the terminal or the vault or the reinforced shelter happen to maintain against the degradation that time and the post-war environment impose on everything they touch. Some of the most important records are almost certainly lost, the work of researchers whose documentation sites were not preserved, whose final expeditions did not produce survivors to carry their notes to locations where those notes might be found. What remains is fragmentary in the way of all historical records, offering glimpses rather than comprehensive accounts, suggesting the full shape of what was learned while making it impossible to recover that shape in its entirety. But the glimpses matter. The records that survive the careful observation logs, the heated debate notes, the final entries made in voices that would not make another entry, the follow-up documentation made by the hands of the people who searched for and sometimes found what the previous entries described, constitute a body of human knowledge about the post-war world's most inexplicable phenomena that represents exactly the kind of achievement that the wasteland consistently makes difficult and that its most remarkable people consistently manage anyway. The cryptid hunters looked at the most mysterious things the wasteland contained and decided that the looking was worth whatever it cost, that the darkness beyond the firelight deserved the specific attention of people willing to carry the light into it, rather than simply acknowledging its existence from a safe distance. Their records are the light they carried. The creatures they documented still move through the forests and rivers and skies of Appalachia, still exceed the frameworks that the documentation attempted to build around them, still pose the questions that the documentation could approach but not resolve. But the documentation exists, which means the questions have been asked with the seriousness they deserve, which means the creatures have been seen not simply as threats to be survived, but as phenomena to be understood, which is the specifically human response to the unknown that distinguishes inquiry from simply fear. The cryptid hunters were afraid of what they were studying. Their records make this clear, in the elevated pulse of the prose that describes close encounters, in the practical urgency of the notes about egress routes and safe distances, and the specific behavioral triggers that the most dangerous creatures display before they engage. They were afraid, and they went anyway, because the understanding was worth more to them than the safety that avoiding the subject of the understanding would have provided. This is the bravest thing the wasteland produces. Not the combat courage that the wasteland requires from essentially everyone who survives long enough to develop any characteristic at all, but the curiosity courage that it consistently penalizes and that its most remarkable people maintain despite the penalty. The names in the terminal entries and the holotape recordings are the wasteland's most honest heroes, not the people who fought the monsters, but the people who tried to understand them, and who paid whatever the understanding cost, without deciding that the cost was too high to continue. And so we reach the end of our long walk through the wasteland's most mysterious territories, through the forests where the Mothman's red eyes catch the light that should not be there, along the rivers where the Ogwa carries its ancient shell through waters that the old world poisoned and that the old biology refuses to abandon, across the high country where the sheep-squatch moves through the wrong kind of beautiful whiteness of its wool, into the dark of the Dunwich sites, where the geological deep time presses up through the stone and the visions begin before you have recognized that anything unusual is occurring. We have walked beside the Wendigo's terrible origin and beneath the Snallygaster's territorial sky, and past the Flatwoods monster's hovering patience, and through the deep implications of a civilization above the clouds that has been watching without explaining itself for longer than the bombs have been a memory. The wasteland's cryptids have not been resolved by the walking. They remain what they were before this account began, the things that exceed the available frameworks, that persist in the landscape beyond the capacity of any taxonomy to fully contain them, that appear in the dark at the edge of the firelight and look back with an awareness that the firelight was supposed to prevent. This is what they are, and this is what they will remain, and there is a specific comfort in this that the desire for resolution sometimes obscures. A world whose mysteries have all been solved is a world that has reached the limits of its own depth, that has nothing left to reveal, that contains only what it has already disclosed. The wasteland's cryptids are evidence that no such limit has been reached, that the world the bombs left behind is still producing things that the people surviving in it have not yet found the frameworks to understand. This is not only frightening, It is in its own way, in the specific way of things that remind you that the universe is larger than any map of it that has yet been drawn, reassuring. You have been to the edge of the firelight tonight. You have looked at the things that move in the dark beyond it, the vast and the ancient and the inexplicable and the cosmic and the deeply, terribly human. You have seen them clearly enough to understand what they are and what they are not, and you are still here, still capable of the specific courage that understanding requires, still in possession of the curiosity that the wasteland's conditions consistently punish and that the best of its people consistently maintain regardless. Rest now, wanderer. Let the red eyes fade and the great wings fold and the ancient shell settle into the deep water and the hovering form drift back toward whatever space it came from. Let the mountain heights grow quiet and the dark rivers slow and the Dunwich stone release its pressure and the stars above resume their patient, ancient indifference to the small fires burning below them. You have walked a long way through a dark landscape tonight, and you have earned the specific peace that comes from having looked at difficult things without turning away. The cryptid hunters kept their notebooks open until the very end. Their records are their gift to you, left in the ruins for whoever came next, for whoever was willing to look where the looking was hardest. Tonight you looked. That is enough. Sleep now, child of the wasteland, in the warmth of everything that the darkness has not yet taken and cannot yet reach. The creatures are still out there. They have always been out there. And so, tonight, has the light.